The idea that before the Civil War, all blacks, both slave and free, were forbidden from learning to read and write is generally believed to be true. Yet evidence shows that a small but significant number of blacks did learn to read and write, some even at the behest of their masters. In this video, we will focus on mostly indentured servants, but not exclusively. We will endeavor to find out why some blacks would be educated by their masters, and what effects it may have had on society in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Let's look at some of the facts and dispel some of the misconceptions about literacy of African Americans in the early United States. When we think of African Americans learning to read in the colonies in early United States, the picture comes to mind of a darkened room where someone is secretly learning to read and write while the master is asleep. Instances of this happening were not uncommon, but were not always the norm. First, let's dispel a misconception. In the states of Maryland and Virginia, there was at no time any law enacted to explicitly forbid the teaching of African Americans, slave or free, the skills of reading and writing, though it was surely frowned upon and not encouraged. Virginia did put severe limitations on such teaching later, but it was never outlawed completely. Most African Americans in Virginia and Maryland before the Civil War were slaves, but a significant number were also indentured servants. Indentured servants were in a class only slightly above slavery. They were bound to a master for a specific number of years, usually lasting until somewhere between their 18th and 24th birthdays, upon which time they were set free. Living conditions were no better for the indentured than for slaves, but there were specific differences. Like slaves, they were required to labor and obey their master, but a legal contract existed between the indentured and the master with specific instructions as to what skills the servants were to learn. These included learning a trade, and these skills could even include reading, writing, and arithmetic. There are many examples of indentured servant contracts from Virginia that specifically include teaching the skills of reading and writing. One example reads, "An indenture made between overseers of the poor and George Paulson to carry out an order made in county court dated 29 October 1789 to bind Severn Scott, son of Sally Scott, free Negro until the age of 21 unto George Paulson, who will provide sufficient meat, drink, washing, lodging, and wearing apparel, teaching him reading, writing, and arithmetic, the trade of shalloper, and also pay him $12 at the expiration of said time." And yet another reads, "An indenture made between overseers of the poor and Spencer Barnes to carry out an order made in county court dated 27 February 1798 to bind Nathaniel, son of Candace, a free Negro, until the age of 21 unto Spencer Barnes, who will provide sufficient meat, drink, washing, lodging, and wearing apparel, teaching him reading, writing, and arithmetic, the trade of a farmer, and also to pay him $12 at the expiration of said time." And still another from Williamsburg reads, "This apprenticeship indenture signed and sealed on April 2nd, 1799, concerns Allie Anthony, an 18-year-old free black girl from Norfolk. At the request of the court, the indenture was arranged by Robert Brough, the Chamberlain or Treasurer of Norfolk, who was responsible for binding out orphans. In this instance, the 18-year-old was bound as an apprentice to Thomas McDormand for 3 years, until she reached the age of 21. During the term of her indenture, Anthony was faithfully to serve her master and obey his lawful demands. In turn, McDormand promised to provide the young woman sufficient food, clothing, lodging, and to train her as a seamstress. In addition, he was to educate her in reading, writing, and arithmetic." One of the reasons a slave might be taught to read and write was religion. Documents from as early as 1680 show this was a concern. This is the title page of Morgan Godwin's The Negroes and Indians Advocate, Suing for Their Admission into the Church, a book intended to be a persuasive to the instructing and baptizing of the Negroes and Indians in our plantations. Christians in early America believed in spreading the word of God to the savage Indians and Africans. What better way to civilize these people than to bring them into the church? There was just one problem. In order to pray and understand the teachings of the church, you needed to be able to read and write. As with everything to do with slavery and indentured servitude, what was the one major driving factor for these systems to begin with? Economics. How much money could a master make? One way to make money was to lease out slaves or servants to other farmers and plantations. It was thought by some owners that the skills of reading, writing, and arithmetic would make a servant more desirable and more valuable in the long run. Rich white landowners worried that slaves, as well as free blacks who could read and write, might travel through white society more easily and be exposed to the ideas of freedom and abolitionism, making them more inclined to rebel. Virginia law never explicitly banned the education of enslaved people, but in the years after Gabriel's conspiracy in 1800, the General Assembly made it more difficult. With the wider circulation of abolitionist pamphlets and after Nat Turner's rebellion, laws were once again tightened, especially in the Deep South. Punishment for trying to learn to read and write could include whipping, amputation, or even death. Here we see a picture of a young black man reading, painted sometime in the mid-1800s. Was he a free man in the North? Was he a slave or indentured servant? Or did he reside in the Deep South? What difference would it make? What difference could he make? We may never know the answers to these questions, but what we do know is this: literacy leads to knowledge, and knowledge leads to freedom.